friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. Well, I'm here for part 2 basically of the freeze drying versus dehydrating, or as I'm most likely to call it, why I turned down the offer for a free freeze dryer. Yes, I did, believe it or not. And the purpose of this video is not to negate any of the great reasons why some people are buying freeze dryers and loving them, because I know there's many of you out there that have one and you love it and you use it a lot. But the main reason I'm putting this out there is because there's a lot of people that simply cannot afford a freeze dryer. And unlike those of us who are content creators, they don't get offers to get free $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 equipment so that they can put up food. And they simply cannot afford that kind of an investment. So the number one reason I keep doing videos like this is to let those people know that no, you do not need a freeze dryer. In fact, of all methods of putting up food, it is the least necessary method. And dehydrating doesn't even have to cost anything because people have been doing it for thousands of years without any fancy equipment like what I have here. I have 2 Cosori dehydrators now. This is my brand new one stacked on top of each other because I'm really liking the Cosori better than the Nesco more and more all the time. So I decided, since my Nescos have been dying one by one, I decided it's time to go ahead and get another dehydrator and go with this. But I do have off-grid ways of dehydrating as well. Though I can use solar power to run my dehydrators, I can't do that during the winter time because we get so little collection in our very dark, rainy area. So during the colder months, as long as I have a fire going, I do a lot of dehydrating on or near my wood stove using a rack that Patrick built, which I'll put a couple video links down below. One is about the rack itself and the many ways I use it. And the other is the one Patrick did several years back on how he made it out of old bed rails. I also want to make sure you go back and watch the part 1 video. It's not called part 1. At the time, I hadn't actually planned on doing a follow-up video, but it will be 2 years ago by the time this video publishes that one had published. So I have come up with even more reasons and made the final decision that no, I am not getting a freeze dryer. And I want to go over those first. But I also want you to go back and watch that if the whole freeze drying thing, you want to understand how it works and some of the differences between the food. I go into far more detail on that than I'm going to here. So other than what I already said about wanting to keep helping people, by not getting a freeze dryer, that forces me to find more ways and be more creative and keep experimenting and finding ways that you can dehydrate food that will put it pretty on par with freeze-dried foods. So that's one of the number one reasons why right there, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But moving on from there, I have been finding out that there's very, very few items that can only be freeze-dried. And all of those items, at least what I've seen so far, are really unnecessary items. So if you're looking at putting up food long-term for just survival, a freeze dryer is absolutely not important. Though candy and ice cream is nice to have, freeze drying candy and ice cream to me is, though it might be tasty and wonderful, these are certainly not important items that to me would make it worth it to buy a freeze dryer just for that. And number 2 is that there's different tricks that you can do to make your dehydrated product more like freeze-dried. For example, when it comes to dehydrating meat. Now, most people know you can easily make jerky, be it beef, venison, elk, using even just your oven, a wood stove, or a dehydrator. And jerky is great. But for those who are looking for something that rehydrates better, because jerky we see as something you eat as is, and it's very chewy, and some people may even have a hard time eating those things because they're kind of hard and chewy. But if you're looking for something that would work better for adding to soups, stews, casseroles, or even you want to snack on straight out of the jar, but you don't want something that's going to hurt your teeth, then there's a trick to get your different meats, such as fish, chicken, turkey, beef, venison, and elk, or whatever else, to dry up so that it is nice and crispy. So you can see in these little clips that I'm putting here, I was dehydrating turkey and salmon, and you can see the final product, how crispy it is and how I can just simply crush it in my fingertips. So there's two ways you can go about this, and one is, such as this venison. This is venison that I had pressure canned. So if the meat was previously pressure canned, all you got to do is open up your jars, put it on your trays, and dehydrate it. And I do have a video where I talk specifically about dehydrating poultry and fish. It also applies to red meats like this. So I'll put the video link to that down below. But basically, it's like I said, the two methods: pressure cooking or canning first and then dehydrating. Or let's say you're making a big old beef roast or elk roast or a whole chicken or turkey, and you bake it up. Any leftover meat you have, put it in a container and freeze it for at least 24 hours. Pull it out, thaw it out just enough to spread it on your trays, then dehydrate it. The process of either the pressure cooking or canning, or the cooking, freezing, and then thawing and dehydrating, either one of those breaks down the meat in such a way that once you go to dehydrate it, it takes on a completely different texture than it would have if you had cut it up raw and dehydrated it, or just cooked it and then dehydrating it. And then another trick would be like for tomatoes. Some people think, well, how do you make tomato powder? They slice up their tomatoes and they dry them and they're still kind of chewy. Well, how I do it so that I don't powder it ever. But what I do is, this turns out very dry, not chewy at all. These are tomato flakes. And what I do is I process them in the blender first. So I'm making a puree, pour them onto my silicone mats, dehydrate it until it's fully dry, and I can just break it up with my fingers. And that will work really good. You can still powder it as needed if you feel you need to, but there's no need to powder the flakes. I do not store tomato powder for a reason, and that is because once you powder that tomato up, when you go to use the tomato out of the jar, you have to vacuum seal it every single time. Or if you keep it in flakes, you don't need to do that. I still will vacuum seal this jar once it's full. I'm in the process of dehydrating tomatoes right now, and I'll be filling this up. And so, and by the way, this half jar, it's just a little over a half jar. That represents 2.5 quarts of pureed tomatoes. That means I should be able to fit, especially if I mash it down with my tamper, I could fit up to 5 quarts of pureed tomatoes in here. So that way I'm taking up far less room than canning like I used to do. I'm no longer canning tomatoes, I'm dehydrating. But anyway, this way I can use the flakes as is, and they will dissolve in water, and I could make any kind of tomato-based sauce out of that, or soup. But what I was trying to say is there's things that you can do. There's a lot of foods. Most of the foods that you dehydrate, you can still powder up. In previous videos, I talked about why I like some freeze-dried fruits, because they're easy to powder up. Well, that really only is going to apply to things that are higher sugar fruits, such as pineapples, mangoes, anything that when you dehydrate it, because of the sugar content, it's always very flexible and gummy. Those things aren't going to powder up. But a lot of your apples, especially if they're a more tart apple, those will powder up beautifully. Berries will powder up just by dehydrating. So to me, the only benefit of freeze-dried, and why I still stock up on some freeze-dried foods, these are all things that I can't grow, such as pineapples, mangoes, and bananas. And these are also all high sugar items anyway that wouldn't powder up for using as flavorings, for making icings and pies and so on. And I cover more of that in other videos. Reason number 4, since shooting that video, some people think you can only freeze dry meat and eggs and milk. Nope, that's not true. I have still managed to dehydrate milk, cheddar cheese, bone broth, and meats of all kinds, raw eggs, and yogurt. I'm still experimenting with more things. So I'm still going to eventually experiment with cream cheese, and right now I'm going to experiment going with avocados. So anyway, it's because of these experimentations, I'm finding there's a lot of things you can dehydrate that we've previously been told you can only freeze dry. So those are the 4 or 5 actually points that I wanted to cover that I've added to my list of reasons why I did turn down the offer for a freeze dryer and why I've decided I really don't want one. But here are a few other reasons I'm just going to touch on real quickly since I went into more details in the first video. I just want to touch on them again here. And that is that there's really very little difference in the amount of nutrients saved in freeze drying as opposed to dehydrating, despite what you've been told. And part of that is because you have to understand what they're actually measuring and what they're comparing it to. If you're dehydrating your foods on lower temperatures, you're going to preserve far more nutrients than if you're dehydrating at 140 to 160 when it comes to vitamins. But that's the thing. It's really only vitamins and certain vitamins that you might lose that get preserved in the freeze drying process. But as soon as you go cook that food, if you're cooking the food, not eating it straight from whatever container you're storing it in, you're still going to lose those same vitamins. And so it really doesn't matter, but you're still going to keep all the protein, minerals, carbs, fiber, and fat if there's fat in it. There's most of your nutrients are still going to stay intact. You're never going to lose those things. Also, that dehydrating actually saves a lot more space than freeze drying does. Freeze drying takes up less room than canning for certain. For a lot of things, dehydrating takes up far less room than freeze drying. But there are a few things, such as mushrooms, that take up the same amount of space, whether it's dehydrated or freeze dried. And then the last reason is that when I dehydrate, be it using electricity, using my wood stove, I don't have to worry about frequent oil changes and other types of maintenance that a freeze dryer requires. Freeze dryers tend to be a lot more noisy and take up more space than a dehydrator does. And and for the size of a freeze dryer, they have a much smaller drying space. So let's say your freeze dryer was this big and you got a real small freeze dryer and it was about the size of this, which I don't know if they make any this small in this size, you would probably only have shelves about that wide that would go in there. So you can't put near as much material into a freeze dryer. And typically freeze drying takes much longer to dry than dehydrating, though not always. Typically that's going to be the case. So you're using more energy, you're running it for longer. So to me, it's just another reason that makes it not worth it. On top of the fact that ever since doing that part 1 video, I did have a lot of people come in and share how much they love their freeze dryer. And that's great. I'm glad that there's people that invested in it, that find it absolutely worth the $3,000 to $5,000 cost for their freeze dryer and worth the time and cost in maintenance and electricity that it uses. And that's great. I am glad that that investment has been worth it to them. But for the sake of those who cannot afford it or can't get a free one like a lot of channels are getting, I've had a lot of people come back and say how much they hated it because it kept breaking down on them. That's the one that got me. And people that then, they kept having issues with it breaking down. They were having issues with the company, wanting to charge them shipping to send it back to have it repaired. And just the shipping of even the smallest freeze dryer alone is going to be pretty expensive because of the weight of it. And shipping costs are going up all the time. So it's really a shame that people are having to pay, if they want to have their very expensive freeze dryer fixed, they have to pay the shipping costs to send it back and have them repair it and then wait the time it takes. And I had one lady that had to have that done told me that happened to her several times. She finally just gave up. She gave up on the freeze dryer altogether. And she loved doing the freeze-dried food, but the cost and the time, all the time that she didn't get to use it because it kept ending up in the shop, that was just too frustrating for her, and she finally just gave up. So now she has a very expensive paperweight. So I do know, however, that there are new companies that are coming out. In fact, the free freeze dryer I was offered was from one of these new companies. But I just tossed that offer. I decided, nope, I'm going to stick to my guns on this because I believe it's important for the sake of those who can't afford a freeze dryer or can't afford the space, because they do take up more space, generally speaking, than most of your dehydrators, then you know, I want to stick to my guns on this to help those people be able to find better ways to do things without feeling pressured into something they can't afford the money or space for. Anyway, again, please go back if you want to learn more about this topic. Please go back and watch my original video, because again, I cover a lot more details in there that I didn't go over in here. I just wanted to make sure I got these points added out there and why I'm continuing to do what I'm doing. And also any of the other video links I think will be helpful that I'll be putting in the description box. So don't forget to click on either more or show more. Somewhere down here below the video screen, you should find that. It'll be real small, and you just click on that. It'll open the description box and you can find all the information I'll be putting in there. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.